All right, welcome to another deep dive. And today we're going deep on, well,
Signs,
signs.
but not like, stop signs or anything like that.
Right.
We're tackling semiotics, the full philosophical theory of signs.
And because you're tuning into this, I know you're the kind of listener who can handle some seriously complex ideas and you want to get to the core of things fast.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, our main source is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Charles Sanders Peirce. And the real meat of this, for a philosopher, I think, is how Peirce helps us understand meaning itself. How do we represent things? What's the connection between a thought and what it's about? That's the territory we're going to explore.
That's deep stuff. So Charles Sanders Peirce, where do we even start with a thinker like this? I mean, the encyclopedia makes it clear this guy was no lightweight. Math, ethics, metaphysics, logic. And semiotics wasn't just a side project for him, right?
No, not at all. For Peirce, you can't really separate semiotics from anything else he was doing. He saw signs as fundamental to, well, just about everything. But the sheer volume of his work can be daunting, that's for sure. And it didn't help that his thinking evolved over time, right? The encyclopedia lays out three main phases of his work on signs. The early account in the 1860s, then an interim account around 1903, and finally what they call the final account between 1906 and 1910.
3 phases. But the encyclopedia also says that even with those changes, Peirce's theory always had the same basic structure, this 3-part structure. So before we get lost in the historical details, can we lay out that foundation? What are the 3 core pieces we need to keep in mind?
Okay, so at the most basic level, Peirce defines a sign as something that's determined by an object. Now, this doesn't mean the object directly creates the sign, like a cause and effect kind of thing. It's more about the object setting the conditions for what the sign has to be in order to represent it. And then that sign determines an effect upon a person. And that effect, Peirce calls it the interpretant. So you have the object, the sign, and the interpretant, 3 parts, always in relation to each other.
So the sign, that's the thing doing the representing, like a word or a picture, or even like you said before, smoke being a sign of fire.
Exactly. And Peirce used a lot of different terms for this, representomen, representation, ground. I think it shows how he kept refining his ideas. But the core idea, the one we need to grasp, is the sign vehicle. It's like not every part of a thing is doing the signifying. Think of a molehill.
Molehill, okay.
So the molehill's a sign of a mole, right? But it's not the molehill's color that's important or its exact size. The important part, the sign vehicle, is the fact that moles make molehills. That causal connection, that's what we focus on.
So it's not just that the molehill exists, it's the way it exists. It's connection to the mole that makes it a sign. And then the object, that's the thing the sign is about. In your example, the mole itself.
Right. And the object, it determines the sign, like we said. But to be clear, for a philosopher listening, this isn't straightforward cause and effect.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Because if the mole just caused the molehill and that was it, there wouldn't be any meaning involved.
Exactly. It's more like the object sets limits on what a successful sign can be. The molehill has to point us to the actual presence of a mole. It's about what conditions have to be met for the sign to work, to refer to its object.
Okay, so determination as a kind of constraint on representation. And that brings us to the interpretant. The Stanford Encyclopedia says this is where Peirce really made a unique contribution. It's the effect the sign has, but specifically on a mind. It's how the mind understands that sign-object relationship. So it's meaning, but it's also an active process, right?
Absolutely. A sign doesn't mean anything in isolation. It only means something when it's interpreted. The interpretant is where the meaning actually happens. And it's not passive, like just receiving data. It's about the mind actively constructing an understanding. You could almost say the interpretant is a translation of the sign.
A translation. So the mind is doing work, taking that sign and making meaning out of it. I like that.
Yeah, and some scholars, like Liska and Savant, they even use the term translatant instead of just interpretant. It emphasizes this active, transformative process.
Translatant. Okay, I can see how that fits. And the encyclopedia also says that the sign determines the interpretant. So it's not just a one-way street.
Right, there's this back and forth. The sign guides us in how we interpret it. It focuses our attention on certain aspects of the relationship between the sign and the objects, like smoke is a sign of fire. It highlights the causal connection, but it doesn't tell us about, say, the size of the fire or what's burning.
So the sign shapes what kind of meaning we're even able to construct from it. It sets the stage for our interpretation.
Okay, let's get into the specifics of Peirce's thinking now. We said there were these 3 phases. His early account, starting around 1867, the encyclopedia says the core 3 parts are there, but the interpretant takes on a really interesting role. It's not just the end of the line, it becomes another sign.
Yeah, this is where things get really heady. Peirce says the interpretant, the meaning we create, well, that itself becomes a new sign for the same object,
Hmm.
and that sign needs to be interpreted, which creates another interpretant, and so on. It's like this chain reaction of meaning making that never really ends.
So meaning is always in motion. We never quite arrive at a final static understanding of anything. That's the idea, at least in this early phase. It's called infinite semiosis. And to a philosopher, this is huge. It suggests that meaning is always open to further interpretation, always unfolding. Now, there's debate among Peirce scholars about whether this idea, infinite semiosis, stays consistent throughout his work, but in the early account, it's definitely front and center.
Okay, infinite semiosis. And then there's the famous part of Peirce, this three-category system he came up with. Icons, indices, and symbols. For someone coming at this from a philosophical angle, what's the big idea behind these categories?
It's all about how the interpreting gets created. How do we connect the sign to its object? So icons, they work because they resemble the object in some way. Think of a portrait. It represents the person because it looks like them. Or a map. It's a sign of a geographical area because it shares its shape and spatial relationships.
It's about likeness,
Yeah.
similarity. Okay, what about indices?
Indices, they point to the object because they're directly connected to it in some way. Often there's a causal relationship, like smoke is an index of fire because the fire actually caused the smoke. Or weather vane, pointing in the direction of the wind. It's physically moved by the wind, so it functions as an index.
So not about how they look, but about a real factual connection. And then we've got symbols.
Right. Symbols, they represent things based on convention, agreement. There's no natural connection, no resemblance. It's just that we, as a community, have decided that this sign stands for that thing. Language is the biggest example. Words are symbols. The word cat doesn't look or sound like a cat, and there's no physical link. It's just that we've all learned to associate that sound with that furry animal.
So likeness, connection, and convention. Three very different ways of creating representation. Makes sense. But the encyclopedia points out something interesting. In this early period, Peirce seemed to think symbols were the most important of the three, and his reasoning had to do with thought itself.
Yes. This is where it gets even more philosophical. Peirce said all thought happens in signs. Our thoughts themselves are signs. And the interpretants we form, they're not just interpreting the world, they're interpreting our thoughts.
Whoa. So thinking is a kind of internal conversation using signs.
That's how Peirce saw it. And at this point in his work, he was super focused on logic. So he saw symbols as the most important because they're potentially general. That means they can be used to create rules and arguments that apply in lots of different situations. Icons and indices, they're tied to specific things, but symbols can operate on a more abstract level. That's what logic needs.
Okay, so it's a very logic-driven way of thinking about signs in this early phase. But then things shift, right? The interim count, around 1903, we go from 3 kinds of signs to 10. And the encyclopedia suggests this change is linked to Peirce doing more work on logic, specifically with a student of his.
Yeah, Oscar Mitchell. They were doing some groundbreaking work on symbolic logic and what's called quantification theory. And this work forced Peirce to think more carefully about how we refer to individual things, not just general concepts. And that meant recognizing the crucial role of indices.
So the more deeply he got into logic, the more he realized he needed more than just symbols to explain how it all works.
Exactly. And it wasn't just indices either. He started to see how even symbols have iconic and indexical features. Like in mathematics, you use symbols, but those symbols sometimes also represent spatial relationships, which is more iconic. So his view of the whole system became much more nuanced.
So a more complex and flexible understanding of signs emerges. And the encyclopedia says that by this point, Peirce had developed a bigger picture of how all his philosophical work fit together. And he saw this theory of signs as a kind of foundation for everything else.
Yes, his architectonic view of philosophy. He divided logic, which he saw as basically the same thing as semiotics, into 3 parts. Speculative grammar, that's where the classification of signs belongs. Then there's critical logic, which is about arguments, and methodeutic, which is about scientific inquiry. So you can see how semiotics is the bedrock, because signs are how we inquire, how we make arguments, how we think about anything at all.
Semiotics as the foundation of philosophy itself. That's bold. Okay, so 10 kinds of signs now. How does this new classification system work? It still uses the 3 parts, sign, object, interpretant, but with more layers, right?
Right, so let's start with the sign. He divides it into 3 subcategories: qualisign, sin sign, and legisign. A qualisign represents something based on a quality, like the color red or the feeling of warmth. A sin sign represents something based on a specific event or existence, like a clap of thunder, that's a sin sign. And a lega sign that represents something based on a rule or a law, like a word or a traffic signal.
Qualisign, sin sign, legisign. So we're getting even more specific about what makes something a sign, and then what about the object?
Well, the object is still divided into icon, index, and symbol, but Peirce acknowledges that pure icons and pure indices are actually pretty rare. Most signs are a mix. He starts using terms like hypoicon and subindex to account for this. A hypoicon might be a diagram, for example. It's iconic because it represents spatial relationships, but it's not a perfect likeness.
So, a more realistic view of how these categories play out in the real world. And what about the interpretant in this interim account? Does it also get split into three?
It does, and this is where it gets really interesting from a philosophical point of view. He calls them reem, decent, and argument, or delome. A reem represents a possibility, a potential quality.
Mm.
Like if you say the dog is deaf, that blank space, that's a reem. You could fill it with any quality. A decent, that's a statement of fact, something that's actually the case, like the dog is brown. And an argument, that's a sign that allows us to make inferences, to connect different thoughts together logically. Like, all dogs are mammals, Fido is a dog, therefore Fido is a mammal. That whole structure, that's an argument.
Okay, so from potential qualities to actual facts to logical connections, the interpreting gets a serious upgrade in this system. But now we've got three categories, each with three subcategories. That's 9. So how do we get to 10 types of signs?
Good catch. Peirce realized that not all combinations are possible. Because of how his philosophy worked, the sign, object, and interpretant had to line up in a specific way. So a qualisign, something signifying through pure quality, can only be an icon and have a romantic interpretant. You can't have a qualisign that's a symbol, for example. It just wouldn't make sense within his framework. So when you work through all the possible combinations, you end up with 10, not 27.
Okay, so there are logical rules governing how these pieces fit together. That makes sense. But Peirce wasn't done yet, right? The final account, starting in 1906, this is where he really digs deep into the object and the interpretant. And the encyclopedia says his thinking here is connected to his ideas about how we acquire knowledge, about the process of inquiry.
Yes. In this late period, Peirce becomes increasingly focused on how signs help us move from doubt to belief. And this leads him to make a crucial distinction between the dynamic object and the immediate object. The dynamic object is the thing in itself, the ultimate reality that the sign is trying to represent. But we never fully grasp the dynamic object directly. We only access it through signs.
So it's like the thing that's really out there, causing the whole chain of signification to begin.
Exactly. And then there's the immediate object, which is how we understand the object at this particular moment
Right.
in the semiotic process. It's our current interpretation, our current model of the dynamic object. And this can change as we inquire further, as we learn more.
So the immediate object is like our working hypothesis, and the dynamic object is the ultimate truth we're trying to reach.
Precisely. And this distinction is crucial from a philosophical perspective because it explains how we can be wrong, how our knowledge can be incomplete. We're always dealing with the immediate object, but the goal is to get closer and closer to the dynamic object through inquiry.
That makes sense. And he does something similar with the interpretant, right? He divides it into immediate, dynamic, and final.
Yes, and he explicitly connects this to his 3 grades of clarity of understanding. The immediate interpretant is the most basic level. It's the potential of the sign to have an effect, the kind of general dictionary definition of what the sign could mean. Like, if you see the word dog, the immediate interpretant is that vague idea of a furry, 4-legged creature. It's the 2nd grade of clarity.
Okay, so the potential for meaning. Then there's the dynamic interpretant, right?
Right, the dynamic interpretant is the actual effect the sign has on your mind in a specific context. It's how you understand the word dog when you see it in a particular sentence, with a particular tone of voice, knowing who's speaking, and so on. It's a situated understanding, and it corresponds to Peirce's 1st grade of clarity, understanding through familiarity. You just get it because of your experience.
It's how the sign lands on you, right here, right now. And then we've got the final interpretant.
Yes. The final interpretant is the ideal endpoint of inquiry. It's the ultimate, stable, and true understanding of what the sign represents, the understanding we would have if we could fully grasp the dynamic object. This is the 3rd grade of clarity, which Peirce connects to his pragmatic maxim, understanding a concept by thinking about its ultimate practical effects. It's the meaning that would be settled, in principle, after an ideal process of inquiry.
Okay, so we move from a vague sense of the sign's meaning to an actual contextualized understanding to finally the most complete and true understanding we could possibly have. That's quite a journey. But this final account, it also gets pretty complicated, right? There's that infamous 66 sign classification system.
Oh, yeah, that's where Peirce really goes for it. He was trying to create a complete map of all possible types of signs. And to do that, he came up with 10 basic elements of signs, each with 3 subcategories. So you got the sign, the immediate object, the dynamic object, how the sign relates to the object, and then all the different kinds of interpretants and their relationships. It gets intense.
10 elements, each with 3 subcategories. How does that even work?
Well, that's the thing. Peirce himself wasn't totally clear on how to combine all these elements, and scholars are still debating it today. Some argue that he didn't actually mean there were literally 66 distinct types of signs. Maybe it's more like a framework for thinking about the different dimensions of signs.
A framework, not a hard and fast list. Makes sense. And to add to the complexity, Peirce also throws in a bunch of other trichotomies for the interpretant. Emotional, energetic, logical. How do those fit into the immediate dynamic final scheme?
Most Peirce scholars think those additional categories are really just different aspects of the immediate dynamic and final interpretants. Like, the emotional interpretant might be part of the dynamic interpretant, but focused on the feeling it evokes. But there are some scholars who think these categories are separate. And it doesn't help that Peirce didn't really explain how they all fit together.
So lots of unanswered questions in this final account. But even with all the complexity, and maybe even because of it, Peirce's theory of signs remains hugely influential in philosophy today. It's hard to think about meaning, representation, or even just knowledge itself without acknowledging his contribution.
Absolutely. He gives us a framework for understanding how thought itself is structured, how we make sense of the world. And that's a powerful tool for any philosopher.
Well, to any philosopher listening, I'd say this. Take what you've learned today and look around. Look at the signs you encounter every day, from the simplest gesture to the most complex philosophical argument. How does Peirce's theory help you understand them? And what does it mean for our understanding of the world if all thought is, at its core, a process of interpreting signs? That's something to ponder. We've given you the tools, now go explore.